Samuel Morgan sat at the head of the table, his calloused hands pressed into the chair as his sons and daughters argued, none of them paying attention to the labored breathing that escaped him, each slower than the last. Samuel raised a hand to intervene. "Enough," he said, his voice shaking but firm. He took a breath, his voice clearly strained. "This land, this house, is more than money." The last word came out weakly, Samuel suddenly clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. Andrew rushed to his side, shouting, "Grandpa!" as Samuel fell forward. The room erupted into chaos. Ambulance sirens wailed. Just minutes before, Samuel's two children had been arguing over a larger share of the estate. Clara, the eldest, her voice was sharp. "You know I've worked harder. You deserve more than a piece of this place. It's time for you to take what's yours." Jacob, her younger brother, shook his head, dismissing her suggestion with equal fervor. "Do you think you deserve more, Clara? You've done nothing but sit back and wait for things to fall into my lap." Their bickering had become a routine, a tired loop that Samuel had grown accustomed to. Samuel's chest tightened as the words flew between them, faster and louder. Andrew, his nephew, stood in the corner of the room, watching. The younger man was used to the dynamic, but still felt restless whenever the conversation became tense. Samuel glanced at Andrew, who nodded reassuringly, but the older man felt the burden of disappointment deepen. Just a moment ago, before his grandfather had been rushed to the emergency room, he had tried to say something to him. "Andrew," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible, "your mum." And with that, he disappeared, leaving Andrew holding him, tears streaming down his face. The unfinished words remained in Andrew's mind, haunting him like an unanswered question, a puzzle piece that refused to fit. Any remedy was too late. Samuel's sudden departure had cast a shadow over family. Clara and Jacob were numb in the days that followed. Regret still lurked in every corner of the house, though neither of them could bring themselves to say it. Andrew, by contrast, had withdrawn completely, retreating to the garden where he and his grandfather had spent countless afternoons. The garden was Samuel's sanctuary, a testament to his simple yet meaningful life. He taught Andrew how to care for the plants, explaining the patience and care required. Samuel often said, "We need love, even when it seems to give nothing back." Andrew repeated those words in his mind as he sat under the oak, his grief weighing heavily on him. A few days later, despite their shared loss, Clara and Jacob soon returned to their old routines. The subject of their father's will arose again. Arguments over the division of property broke out, despite the will being in place. Andrew overheard their conversation from the hallway, but said nothing. He felt out of place, despite having lived in the house his whole life. No one in the family ever talked about his parents, and the absence of answers had become an unspoken truth. All he knew was that his grandfather had loved him unconditionally, and now that anchor was gone. The vague stories of his mother's death, told only in passing by Samuel, offered little comfort. Andrew couldn't help but feel a hollow ache, a longing to know where he truly belonged. For the first time, he wondered if Samuel knew more than he was letting on, and if those secrets would die with him. Samuel had always been disappointed in his two children. Though he never said it outright, Andrew could see it in the way his brother's shoulders slumped after an argument. But Samuel had always believed in the power of love and patience to heal. Without his children knowing, he had spent the last months of his life planning to teach them one last lesson. The will was read the following week, and the family prepared for what was to come. Clara and Jacob both speculated about its contents, their conversations thinly veiled to hide their guilt and anticipation. Samuel's absence was keenly felt, but his presence lingered in every corner of the house. After Samuel's death, his children swiftly arranged the funeral, their sorrow palpable but tempered by the underlying tension. Clara and Jacob, though clearly mourning their father's passing, couldn't shake their obsession with the inheritance. It was as if the loss of Samuel was overshadowed by the prospect of what they would receive from him. The funeral was a formality, a brief moment of grief that gave way to the pressing issue at hand, the will. When the day came to read Samuel's will, the family gathered in the living room, the lawyer seated across from them, ready to deliver the unexpected news. As the lawyer spoke, his words sent shockwaves through the room. Samuel had left the majority of his estate to someone named Cecilia Ross, a woman entirely unknown to the family. The revelation hit Clara and Jacob like a slap to the face. They exchanged looks of disbelief, their minds racing to comprehend the impossible. Their father, Samuel, had never mentioned a Cecilia Ross, and they were left wondering who she was and why she was now the beneficiary of everything they had expected to inherit. Clara was the first to break the silence. "Who the hell is this woman? What right does she have to take everything?" Jacob's voice trembled with frustration as he turned to the lawyer. "This is some kind of mistake. My father would never—" The lawyer interrupted, his tone steady but firm. "I assure you, this is exactly as Samuel intended." The room was thick with silence, save for Clara's sharp intake of breath and Jacob's frustrated muttering. The anger bubbled up in them, not just at the will itself, but at the thought that Samuel had chosen someone outside the family to take the majority of his fortune. Their father's legacy, his work, his life, everything they believed was rightfully theirs, was now in the hands of a stranger. Andrew, though just as confused, sat quietly in the corner, his mind spinning. He didn't know who this Cecilia Ross was either, but his curiosity began to outweigh his frustration. He couldn't understand why Samuel had made such a decision, but something deep inside told him there was more to this than met the eye. He found himself more intrigued than angry, even as Clara and Jacob's emotions spiraled out of control. As the lawyer continued to explain, it became clear that this was no mistake, no clerical error. Samuel had made his choice deliberately. He had left behind a letter which the lawyer handed over to the family. It seemed to be Samuel's final message to his children, and with it came an unexpected twist. The letter suggested that Cecilia Ross was not just a beneficiary, but someone who had played a significant role in Samuel's life. Samuel wrote that Cecilia had taught him valuable lessons about love, patience, and sacrifice, and that she was now meant to help the family understand the deeper meaning of the legacy he had tried to impart. Clara, her face reddening with rage, could barely keep her composure as she read the letter aloud. The words stung, each sentence a reminder of the disconnect between what Samuel had left behind and what his children felt entitled to. Her disbelief only deepened with each line, her mind reeling as she tried to reconcile the idea of Cecilia Ross being part of the family's future. Clara's anger was palpable, and Jacob shared her frustration, pacing around the room, muttering to himself. They couldn't comprehend why their father would turn to someone else for guidance, someone they had never known, instead of relying on them. Andrew, still processing the situation, felt an unease settle in his stomach. The letter hinted at things he couldn't yet understand, things that Samuel had left unsaid during his life. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to Cecilia Ross than just an inheritance. It was clear now that Samuel had hoped for something more, something that the family wasn't prepared to grasp. While Clara and Jacob fumed, Andrew's curiosity grew stronger. He felt the weight of his father's words and wondered what this Cecilia Ross could really offer them, and why Samuel believed her to be so important. The tension in the room continued to rise, but there was nothing left for them to do but absorb what had just been revealed. The lawyer stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. With no further words to add, he reminded them that they would need to reach out to Cecilia Ross. Time was ticking, and the answers they sought lay in her hands. After the death of Samuel Morgan, his family found themselves sifting through his personal belongings, hoping to uncover more about the mysterious woman named Cecilia. They knew little about her, only whispers of a past that had long been buried. But as they combed through old papers, nothing substantial turned up. It seemed Samuel had kept his connections to her tightly sealed, as if hiding some deep shame. That was until Andrew stumbled across a weathered letter buried beneath a pile of forgotten documents. The envelope, worn with age, bore Samuel's handwriting, and inside was a letter addressed to Cecilia. The words were filled with regret, his penitent tone stark against the otherwise stern pages. "I should have told you the truth sooner," it read. "I failed you, Cecilia, and for that, I am truly sorry." The letter went on to mention a location, an address in a quiet suburban area. It was a place Andrew had never heard of, but it was a lead, one that could not be ignored. The family decided to visit the address, driven by curiosity and perhaps the guilt of never acknowledging Cecilia's existence. The car ride was tense, each member lost in their own thoughts, wondering what they would find, or perhaps what they hoped to avoid. When they arrived, it wasn't what they expected. The house was modest, simple even, standing in stark contrast to the grand mansion they had always associated with the Morgan family legacy. It was as if the house itself knew it was forgotten, tucked away in an unremarkable corner of the world. Cecilia greeted them at the door. She was an older woman now, her appearance soft but worn, as though time had caught up with her long ago. There was no grand entrance, no warm hospitality, just a quiet acknowledgement of the truth that had been concealed for far too long. "I am Samuel's daughter," she said calmly, her voice steady, but carrying a weight of untold history. "He never spoke of me. I was erased from your family story." Clara's eyes narrowed at the admission, her lips pressed tight, as though she were trying to hold back a flood of emotions. Jacob stood slightly behind her, his face hardening at the unexpected revelation. The idea of someone else claiming part of Samuel's legacy, someone they had never known existed, left them both uncomfortable. The fact that Cecilia spoke so plainly about the rejection she had faced only deepened their unease. Andrew, on the other hand, was more conflicted. He watched her, his mind racing. There was a strange pull in her words, a sense of truth in her gaze that made him question everything he had believed about his family. Cecilia didn't fit the image of the wealthy heiress they had conjured in their minds. There was no aura of entitlement or bitterness in her demeanor. Instead, there was a quiet sorrow, a woman who had lived in the shadows of a life she never asked for. As the family stood there in uncomfortable silence, Cecilia looked directly at Andrew, her eyes welling with tears. "I never thought I would see you again," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But you're my son, Andrew. I am your mother." She paused, her face trembling as the tears began to fall. "I've waited so long for this moment." Her words, filled with a mix of sorrow and hope, hung in the air, carrying the weight of a lost time that could never be reclaimed. Andrew was shocked. It turned out he was not an orphan like his grandfather always said. The truth came too quickly for him to accept. He stood there silently, unable to say anything. The tension between the family members was palpable. Clara and Jacob exchanged glances, their discomfort evident as they tried to come to terms with the reality that someone had been left out, not only of their family, but of their history. Their father's hidden past, his mistakes, all laid bare in front of them, and they didn't know how to deal with it. Cecilia, however, seemed unbothered by their unease. She sat down at the small, modest table and invited them to do the same, though it was clear they were reluctant. Cecilia had kept the truth buried for years, but now, sitting in the quiet of the old family home, the weight of her past pressed down on her, and the words finally slipped out. "I once loved a man named Daniel. He wasn't rich, but he was good to me. Samuel didn't see it that way. He said I was tarnishing the family name, and that was the end of it." She paused, eyes briefly drifting, as if still haunted by the memory. When I found out I was pregnant with Andrew, Samuel gave me no choice. He told me I had to leave. He couldn't let anyone know, so he said I was dead. He made up the story, told everyone I had passed away, and I had to go along with it. The room felt heavy with the revelation, though no one spoke at first. Clara and Jacob, so young at the time, couldn't remember any of it. They were only 3 and 5, too small to retain anything about their older sister. But Samuel had ensured that no one would. He forbade anyone from speaking her name again, erased her entirely from the family's history. I tried to see them, Cecilia continued, her gaze fixed on the floor. But Samuel made it impossible. He didn't want them to remember me. He wanted to control everything. The room grew quieter. She paused, wiping a tear from her eye. But Samuel, he regretted it. He did, in his own way. That's why he left the will. He wanted to make amends. He maybe hoped that somehow we could all find a way to heal. Cecilia's voice trailed off, her confession hanging in the air like a cloud of dust, settling in the silence. She didn't expect forgiveness. She didn't even expect understanding. But at least the truth was out, no longer trapped inside. And somewhere in her heart, she wondered if the family could finally piece together the parts of the past they had all been so carefully taught to forget. As the words sank in, the reality of what Samuel had done became clearer. He had tried to bury the past, thinking that erasing it would solve the problem. But now, with the will in hand, it was clear that his regrets weren't enough to undo the damage. The family had been shattered long ago, and no simple gesture of reconciliation could fix that. Clara and Jacob sat quietly, their expressions unreadable. They had never known this side of their father, and the weight of his actions, hidden for so long, was almost too much to bear. Their memories of Samuel were filled with his sternness, his unyielding control. But now, in the wake of Cecilia's words, they began to question everything they had believed about him. For Andrew, the truth was a heavy burden to carry. He had grown up without a mother, without the presence of someone who could have guided him through life's hardest moments. Now, to learn that his own grandfather had erased his mother from the story of their family, it shook him to the core. But, in the midst of the pain, there was a flicker of something else. A chance for them to rebuild, to put aside the lies that had been passed down through the years, and face the truth about their family, about who they were, and where they had come from. The conversation was slow to follow, each word carefully chosen. No one rushed to speak. But one thing was certain: this revelation was only the beginning. The truth, once hidden, had now been exposed, and its consequences would ripple through their lives in ways they hadn't yet imagined. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was Clara who broke the silence first, her voice soft but sharp, laced with disbelief. How could she do this? How could she just come back after all these years, thinking she can just waltz into our lives and claim what's ours? Her words were not just an accusation against Cecilia, but a reflection of the betrayal she felt in her father's secrecy. Jacob, too, struggled to process it, but his response was more biting. "It's not about forgiveness, Clara. It's about what she's trying to take from us now. You know damn well she has no right to any of this." He pointed at the house, the land, everything Samuel had worked for. "We've worked for this. We've earned it. She hasn't been here, hasn't been a part of this family, and now she wants to walk in like she belongs." Andrew, sitting quietly off to the side, felt the weight of their words. His thoughts were clouded with confusion and hurt. He had grown up without a mother, never knowing why she wasn't there, and now the truth about her seemed too much to accept. But more than that, There was the issue of the inheritance, the thing that seemed to have torn his family apart. "I don't know what to say," Andrew finally spoke up, his voice strained, almost hesitant. "But I have the right to know her. She's my mother." Clara shook her head. "You don't get it, Andrew. She's been gone for so long. How can you just accept her like that? She has no claim to anything here." Jacob, ever more cynical, added, "And don't think for a second she's doing this out of some motherly instinct. She's here for the inheritance, just like anyone else. You'd be a fool to believe otherwise." Their words were sharp, designed to draw a line between Andrew and Cecilia. They couldn't let him make the same mistake they had. The inheritance was a matter of family, and neither of them were willing to share it with someone who had been absent for so long. Andrew's mind was a whirlwind. On one hand, he couldn't shake the longing to understand his mother, to find out why she had disappeared all those years ago. But on the other, he knew there was more at stake now than just his personal emotions. "You both think she's here for the money," he said quietly. "But I have to know the truth. I have to hear her side." Clara and Jacob exchanged glances, both trying to steer him away from this path. "Don't let her manipulate you," Clara warned. "You don't owe her anything." Jacob added, "You think she'll just waltz back in and everything will be fine? You don't know her, Andrew. She's been gone too long. She has no place here, and neither do you if you side with her." Their voices dripped with concern, but there was something else beneath it. Fear. Fear of losing what they had worked so hard for, fear of Andrew's loyalty shifting, fear that the past would be rewritten in a way they couldn't control. Cecilia, for her part, was unflinching in her resolve. She knew the truth would sting, but she had to tell it. She stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with an urgency that couldn't be ignored. "I understand your anger," she said, looking at each of them in turn. "But I want you to know that I never wanted to leave Andrew. I was forced to, and I didn't have a choice. Please, give me a chance to explain." "I'll hear you out," Andrew said finally, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside. "But it's going to take time for me to understand, and I don't know if I'll ever forgive you." The words hung in the air, and while there was no certainty in Andrew's decision, there was a quiet resolve. He was going to seek the truth, and he would do it on his terms, but that didn't mean he was ready to let go of the pain she had caused. Clara and Jacob are silent, their faces hard, the fight still burning in their hearts. There would be no quick resolution here, no easy answers. The truth was a bitter pill, and they weren't ready to swallow it just yet. But Andrew had already taken the first step towards something that would change everything. Andrew had spent the last few days getting to know Cecilia better. It wasn't easy, given the tension that had built up over the years, but there was something about her quiet sincerity that made him want to listen. She had been through so much, and though the past could never be undone, her willingness to open up made something shift in him. One afternoon, Cecilia pulled out a small box from under her bed. Inside were letters, old photographs, and trinkets she had kept from her time with the family. "These are from Samuel," she told Andrew, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "I never told you, but he wrote to me all the time, even after I left. I kept them, thinking one day we could make sense of it all." Andrew took the box carefully. Each letter felt like a weight, as if it carried not just words, but years of regret and missed chances. He sat with them, flipping through pages of Samuel's handwriting. The words were raw, heartfelt. Samuel's regrets were clear in every line. "I never should have let you go, Cecilia. My pride, my stubbornness." "It's all I've got left now," one letter read. Samuel had never spoken like this, not even to Andrew. Seeing the vulnerability in his father's words was jarring, but it was the truth. Back in the living room, Clara and Jacob were still keeping their distance from Cecilia, but they had been watching her, their attitudes slowly shifting. It was clear that she wasn't the cold, bitter woman they'd remembered. She wasn't just here to claim what was theirs, to dig up old wounds. Cecilia seemed genuine, and over time, that began to chip away at the walls they'd built. One evening after dinner, Jacob leaned over to Clara, speaking quietly. "She's different now. I didn't expect that. She seems regretful, you know." Clara nodded. She hadn't wanted to admit it, but seeing Cecilia with Andrew, seeing her gentle approach to him, was changing her mind. The woman they once thought was a stranger now seemed like someone who had loved their father, just as they had. "Maybe we've been too harsh," she said, her voice lower than usual. The breakthrough came when they all sat down to have a real conversation. Andrew, Clara, and Jacob, their minds full of what they had learned, finally began to open up. They talked about the past, the pain, the mistakes, but it wasn't the same as before. This time, it wasn't about blame. It was about moving forward. "We need to rebuild this," Andrew said, glancing at Cecilia. "Not just the house, not just the estate. Our family." There was silence for a moment. Then Jacob spoke, his voice firm. "I agree. We can't keep letting this divide us. It's time to let go of what's been done and figure out how to make it right." And for the first time in years, the family sat down together without the weight of anger between them. There were no more silent judgments, no more unspoken resentments. They were ready to heal. And though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, the willingness to try made all the difference. Cecilia had invited the Morgan family to her home, a move she had planned carefully. She was ready to make her intentions clear. As the family gathered, Cecilia, calm and composed, announced that she wanted to share the inheritance equally. "No one should feel left out. Not after everything we've been through," she said. Her voice was firm but gentle, a clear signal that she had thought this through. Clara, initially skeptical, began to soften. She had spent years thinking of her own interests, her own struggles. But now, seeing Cecilia's generosity, a wave of guilt swept over her. She couldn't deny the truth that had been right in front of her all along. "Maybe I was wrong," Clara thought as she sat quietly. The harsh words she'd spoken before, the selfish demands, all seemed so distant now. Her attitude slowly shifted as she saw Cecilia not as a rival, but as someone who had stepped into their lives with genuine care. Jacob, ever the skeptic, took a while to process everything. But after some time alone to reflect, he realized how much damage the constant fighting had done to the family. The arguments over money had only driven wedges between them. He started to understand that keeping up the fight wasn't the way forward. Gradually, he became more open to the idea of unity. The walls he had built around himself, built from years of distrust, began to crumble. He was still wary, but he knew it was time to change. Meanwhile, Cecilia and Andrew were slowly rebuilding their bond. What had been a strained relationship, marked by years of distance and unspoken resentments, was starting to heal. Cecilia shared stories from her past, stories of her own struggles and joys, stories that Andrew had never heard before. As they talked, their connection deepened. For Andrew, it wasn't just about having a mother. It was about having someone who truly understood him. The walls between them, built by time and silence, were finally starting to come down. As the family came together in this new spirit of reconciliation, they made a collective decision. They would hold a memorial for Samuel, a ceremony not only to honor him, but to restore the unity that had been lost over the years. They knew this wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start towards healing the rifts, both in their hearts and in their home. The decision was unanimous. The memorial would serve as a reminder of the family's strength, a testament to Samuel's legacy. With each passing day, the tension that had once defined their interactions slowly faded. The family began to talk more openly, share more honestly, and trust each other again. It was a slow process, but they all understood now that without this unity, nothing else would matter. The inheritance wasn't just about money, it was about healing the broken bonds and restoring what had been fractured. In the end, it wasn't the wealth that brought them together. It was the decision to choose family over everything else. The family gathered in the garden, the same place Samuel had spent countless hours tending to his plants, now a quiet backdrop for the day of remembrance. It wasn't the sort of place where people expected grand speeches or lavish displays. Instead, it was a place for reflection. Cecilia arrived with a small box of Samuel's keepsakes. She'd spent the night carefully picking through his things, gathering items that held meaning to him, old gardening tools, faded photographs, and letters from friends. She began passing them around, offering a glimpse into the man he had been, a man who had always worked in silence and never sought recognition. The family gathered around her, each item sparking memories, some spoken aloud, others left unsaid. Andrew stood off to the side, holding a paper in his hand, preparing for his speech. He wasn't sure what words could capture Samuel's essence. How do you sum up a man who was both so deeply loved and yet so often misunderstood? But he had to try. For his uncle, for the family. Meanwhile, Clara and Jacob were busy making the final preparations. They arranged the chairs in neat rows, set the small wooden podium Samuel had once used for his speeches, and placed the flowers Cecilia had brought in the center. The morning light made the flowers vibrant, the air still and heavy with anticipation. People began arriving, close friends, old neighbors, and family members who hadn't been seen in years. Some came with tears in their eyes, others with smiles, remembering the kindness Samuel had shown them in quiet moments. They gathered around, swapping stories about his generosity, his willingness to help, even when it wasn't easy. Each story painted a picture of a man whose actions spoke louder than his words, a man who had quietly built a legacy without ever calling attention to it. When the time came for Andrew to speak, the crowd fell silent. He approached the podium, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the papers in front of him. He didn't look up at first, focusing instead on the words in his hands. Samuel Morgan was the kind of man who gave without asking for anything in return, he began. A man who loved this family, loved this land, and loved the work he did. We are here today because of him. He paused, swallowed hard, and we'll carry that legacy with us. The words were simple, but they resonated. In that moment, everyone felt the weight of the loss, but also the warmth of the memories. The family had been fractured in so many ways, but Samuel's life had shown them the strength of staying together, of supporting one another. After Andrew's speech, the group spent the rest of the day quietly reflecting, walking through the garden, and talking about the good times they had shared with Samuel. There was no animosity between Clara and Jacob, no arguments over the estate, just a shared understanding of what Samuel had wanted for them. Peace, unity, a sense of belonging. The memorial wasn't the end of the story, but it was a turning point. As the sun set, the family lingered in the garden, feeling closer than they had in years. Samuel's memory had done what he always intended. It brought them back together, reminding them that family wasn't about possessions or grudges, but about love and the time you spend with one another. The Morgan family was slowly finding its footing again, each member stepping into a new role, a new purpose. The pain of losing Samuel was still there, lurking in quiet moments, but they were beginning to move forward, one step at a time. Clara, once solely focused on managing the family's estate, now found herself drawn to a different kind of work. She had always been good with numbers, but Samuel's legacy had taught her there was more to life than just wealth. She began volunteering at a local community center, helping underprivileged families navigate their finances, The work was challenging, but it gave her a sense of fulfillment she hadn't expected. Helping others in need, guiding them through the same struggles she had experienced, brought her peace. It was as if the purpose Samuel had left her was finally clicking into place. Jacob, too, had found a new path. For years, he had clung to the notion that his work on the estate would define him. But after his father's death, he realized he needed something more. He enrolled in a course to become a certified arborist, following in Samuel's footsteps. Samuel had always loved the land, but Jacob now found his solace in caring for trees, learning the science behind their growth and how they could benefit the environment. It was a way for him to honor his father without feeling burdened by the past. Every tree he planted was a tribute to Samuel's love for nature, but it was also a way for Jacob to reconnect with the world outside the family's estate. Andrew, as always, was the quiet one, but his role had shifted too. He became the one who held the family together, not just in the traditional sense, but in practical ways. He started working as a mediator for local disputes, helping families navigate their differences and find common ground. It was a job that made use of his natural ability to listen and understand, and in doing so, he had helped countless people come together. But it also helped him heal. Each case, each resolution, reminded him that it was possible to find peace, even in the most broken relationships. It was something he was learning to apply within his own family. Cecilia, who had once felt like an outsider, had come into her own. She took on the role of managing the estate, a responsibility she hadn't imagined herself taking. But in doing so, she brought with her a fresh perspective. She worked alongside Clara and Jacob, helping to plan for the estate's future and ensuring Samuel's wishes were upheld. Slowly, she gained the trust of her new family. There was still some distance, but it was lessening with each day. Cecilia had become a bridge between the old and the new, offering a steady hand as the family moved toward a future they were beginning to rebuild together. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. The pain of loss still lingered, and each member of the family had their own way of coping. But they were learning to work together, to share the responsibilities that once felt like burdens. The family was healing, one small step at a time. And then came the day when they gathered in the garden, as they had done so many times before. But this time it felt different. It wasn't just a meal or a simple gathering. This time, they planted something new, something that would live on long after they were gone. They had decided to plant a tree, a symbol of their new beginning. Clara, Jacob, Andrew, and Cecilia stood together, their hands working in unison to dig the hole and place the young tree into the earth. It wasn't just any tree. It was a reflection of their journey, of the way they had come together, despite the pain, to create something that would grow and flourish in the years to come. As the tree was planted, they all stood in silence for a moment. There were no words, no speeches, just the quiet understanding that this was their future, their new beginning. It was a promise to themselves, to Samuel, and to the family they were becoming. With the last scoop of soil, they covered the roots, and the tree stood tall, a living testament to their strength, resilience, and the love that would continue to grow, just like the tree in the garden.